Good morning, everyone, and I'm very grateful that you joined us this morning. I'm joined today by advocates and leaders in Chicago for an exciting discussion, moderated by Rebecca Sive, who's an old friend and a celebrated author. Vote her in. I recommend it to all of you. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Suffragists spent over 70 years fighting for the right to vote for women. And though 1920 was a landmark year, the battle for the right to vote was marred by the endemic racism in the country as a whole. Women such as Ida B. Wells were told at one of the most famous marches for suffrage to go to the back of the line. Women of color were left out of conversations, deliberately excluded by white suffragists who argued that the right to vote would be delayed if racism was addressed. As a result, many Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American women were left out when the 19th Amendment was passed. I've spoken before about the urgent need to advance racial equity. We must also reckon with the harm caused by racist policies and practices. When we look to the centennial anniversary of women's suffrage, an equity lens will help us figure out how to move forward. For example, this year, the Chicago organizers of Equal Pay Day, many of whom are with us on today's panel, officially moved the date of commemoration to October 29th. This date more accurately reflects that our Latina sisters suffer more acutely than other women when it comes to the fight for equal pay. In our conversation today, we will look at the fight for the 19th Amendment and look forward to what we need to do today to ensure voting access and inclusion for all Americans in November's election. With the Postal Service under attack at a time when vote by mail is more important than ever, and voting rights are continuously under attack, particularly for communities of color, this is a conversation of national urgency. I'd now like to welcome Illinois State Comptroller Susana Mendoza to say a few words before Rebecca begins our discussion.
I wanted to make sure I was off of mute. Good morning, everyone. I want to say thank you so much, President Precwinkle, for inviting me to join this great panel on such a wonderful occasion, the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. You know, like everyone who's joining us here today, I certainly love my country, and I cherish our constitutional right to elect the people who represent us in government. That's so important. And the right to vote is so really precious and sacred as far as I'm concerned. But today, as we mark a century since the 19th Amendment was enshrined in the Constitution, women all across this country still have so much work to do in our quest for equality. I mean, remember a few things here. We are paid less than men for doing the same work. We are still charged more than men for the same goods and services. We are responsible for most of the housework, child rearing, and financial decisions in our homes. Many of us take care of our elderly parents. And even though we make up more than 50% of the nation's population, we are not even remotely adequately represented in our government. So yeah, I like to think that the most important action that you can take today to honor the women who came before us is to actually be engaged in your community and in your government. I mean, don't leave it to other people to fight for the things that you believe in. Don't assume that someone else is watching out for you and your generation. And definitely don't fall for the notion that someone else will sacrifice their own self-interests to make sure that yours are protected. I mean, I'm hoping and calling on everyone in this election cycle as we figure out how we're going to get past what we're living through today. It's important to be an active citizen, to be engaged and be informed, to vote, to get involved, write your elected officials, read books, follow the news, stay up to date on what's going on in our country, and fight for what you believe in. And the last thing I wanted to share is that in 2010, at the behest of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, I had this awesome privilege of traveling to Iraq as one of only 7 lawmakers, female lawmakers from around the country, to help serve in an official capacity to monitor the first free election under the new Iraqi government. It was historic. It was incredible. But honestly, as soon as we landed and as soon as we started moving around the region, you could hear gunfire and you could hear explosions going off, even on election day. It was scary. It was perilous. But there was this very real possibility that Iraqi citizens would die. Some actually did on election day as they made their way to the polls to vote. Yet they bravely continued to do so. It was so important for them to defy the terrorists that day and to cast their votes under a new government. I'll never forget, the part that sticks with me to this day is how the Iraqi women were just so proud to show off their purple fingers. Everyone was like this after they had voted. I think about that a lot, and I believe we should all take a step back every now and then to remember how comparatively easy we have it compared to other places here in the United States when it comes to voting, even with obstacles that a certain horrific president tries to place in our path, and even in the midst of this pandemic. You know, as we recall, the American suffragists who were ridiculed, they were beaten, and they were imprisoned over 80 years ago for seeking the right to vote. Let's remember that, and let's not take their work for granted. Thank you for having me join today.
And thank you all. I hope everyone can hear me. Can you raise your hands just so I can test? All right. So first of all, we are making good trouble today. As President Preckwinkle and Comptroller Mendoza said, there's not anything more important these days. But I wanted to begin with all of you out there and here with a moment of silence in remembrance of Jacob Blake. One thing, when I want to just say to you that I listened, and we're here all about talking about strong women and women who make a difference. I wanted to honor his mother, Julia Jackson, here today, and his sister, Letitra Widman, and just begin with a quote from his sister, who I was saying to our panelists earlier, I was been crying about this, but what she said, and this is what we're about today, is I don't want pity, I want change. And that's what we're doing today. That's what we'll keep doing. That's what President Precwinkle, who was so gracious to invite all of us to participate, has encouraged us to do. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to have several important questions with this fabulous panel. We're going to keep to our timetable. I want everyone to know that. So just be forewarned and forearmed, so to speak. And I want to begin by briefly reading the bios of each of our panelists so that you know who they are. And when you see their faces again, which you undoubtedly will, you will know more about them. And of course, I begin with my dear and longtime friend. We won't talk about how many decades that is, President Preckwinkle. So here we are. I'm going to look down through my glasses so all of you know I can read. Toni Precwinkle is the 35th president of the Cook County Board of Commissioners, an office she has held since 2010. A dedicated and effective public servant, President Precwinkle has worked tirelessly and collaboratively to reshape county government through increased fiscal responsibility, transparency, and improved services with a focus on advancing racial equity. As the top executive in Cook County, President Preckwinkle oversees one of the nation's largest public health and hospital systems and one of the nation's largest criminal justice systems. She is a lifelong advocate for equity, and through her work as board president has fought to improve healthcare access and bring increased fairness to the criminal justice system. I can't think of anything more important as we sit here today. Comptroller Mendoza became the first Hispanic independently elected to statewide office in Illinois when she was elected comptroller in 2016. She is a daughter of Mexican immigrants who became the youngest member of the 92nd Illinois General Assembly when she was elected in 2000. She was the first woman elected Chicago City Clerk in 2011. She is an Aspen Institute Rodel Fellow in Public Leadership, a Hispanics Organized for Political Equality Binational Fellow, say that 5 times, and is on the National Let America Vote Board of Advisors. Audra Wilson is president and CEO of the Schreiber National Center on Poverty Law. Prior to arriving at Schreiber, Audra served as the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois, where she led critical change to expand the mission of a 100-year-old civic engagement organization with nearly 4,000 members and over 40 chapters statewide. In October 2019, Wilson was appointed chair of the Cook County Commission on Women's Issues by Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle. Cherita Ellens leads Women Employed as the president and CEO. She is a native Chicagoan and longtime advocate for Chicago women, youth, and families. As a proven nonprofit leader, Ellens brings a unique perspective and a wealth of experience in organizational development, nonprofit fiscal financial management, marketing and communications, and employment policy. Dorri McWhorter became the CEO of the YWCA Metropolitan Chicago in March 2013. She has embarked upon a journey to transform the 140-year-old social service agency to a 21st century, social enterprise. Dorri prides herself on being a socially conscious business leader and is committed to creating an inclusive marketplace by leveraging a multi-sector approach across business, civic, and community organizations. And last, but by no means least, another friend, Felicia Davis, who is the president and CEO of Chicago Foundation for Women. Felicia, like several of the others here, is a proud Chicagoan and a self-described girl from the South Side. She is deeply committed to community through inclusive service to others. For her, the transformational idea of being a social change agent coexists with a deep awareness of the practical realities facing our society. Felicia believes in the power to transform individual lives, families, and whole communities through collective efforts, and that advancing equality and equity are causes worth fighting for. Indeed, worth fighting for, and that's really the conversation we're going to have today, as President Preckwinkle said, looking back, but really looking ahead to what we can do to create equity, fairness, and equality. So I want to begin now with these questions, and we do have an opportunity for people to comment later in the program, but I hope you'll take this chance to really listen in and listen carefully. These women are the best and the brightest, is what I would say, in our city. So in this first question, I'm going to ask each panelist to speak for a couple of minutes. We'll go in the order in which I read these bios, beginning with President Preckwinkle. So here is the question at hand. In the context of making good trouble, understanding that the nation's progress towards equality for all is flawed by, as the president mentioned, ongoing systemic racism and sexism, including in its provision of the right to vote and access to the voting booth, please share your organization's message for equal political participation in the times ahead of us when, as Comptroller Mendoza pointed out, when the nation is so polarized along race and economic lines. So we'll begin with President Preckwinkle and then go to Comptroller Mendoza.
Sure. I think it's important that we focus on the November elections. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. We all have an obligation to participate in this election. We have a very profoundly troubled president of the United States, and he's someone who, frankly, has catered to white supremacists, if not encouraged and supported them. After all, in Charlottesville, he said that the tiki torch bearing white supremacists were, fine people, just as those who were protesting against them were fine people. I don't know how you can say that in good conscience. He's continuously denigrated immigrants to our country. And immigrants, of course, have always been one of the encouragement of immigration has always been one of the great strengths of this nation. He talked in his campaign about Mexican immigrants being, murderers and rapists, and has continued his assault on immigrants throughout his presidency. This is a profoundly anti-democratic president of the United States. Talking just about white supremacy and anti-immigrant sentiment, it's a much longer list, of course, of challenges that we face. And in his personal life, of course, he's shown this terrible disrespect for women. But I think it's really important that we understand that we've got, not only we have to vote. I always say, as a history teacher, I would tell my students, your first obligation as a citizen is to vote, but that's necessary but not sufficient. You got to work for good candidates and you got to contribute to them. And let me just say, contributing to them is a really important part of our democratic process. We want our candidates to know that they can count on financial support from women as well as men. And that, unfortunately, has not been the case historically for candidates, whether or not you're men or women. Let me just say, if you're looking for places where you can get your mail-in ballot, I know many people have health concerns about going to the polls personally, you can go to chicagoelections.gov or cookcountyclerk.com for information about mailing in your ballot. That's chicagoelections.gov, cookcountyclerk.com to find information about mail-in ballots. If you're healthy and able to vote in person, early voting begins October 19th and continues until November 2nd. So starting October 19th, you can early vote in person. And let me encourage all of you, particularly young people, we need election judges. And in our country, most of our election judges, frankly, are gray-haired people like me. There are senior citizens, civic-minded senior citizens who come in every election and make it possible for their fellow citizens to vote. But in this election, many of our senior citizens feel particularly imperiled by the pandemic, and as a result, have declined to serve as election judges. So clearly, you need to vote. You need to encourage family and friends to vote. You need to share with people the information about mail-in ballots, about early voting in person, as well as on election day. If you're able to, we need you to volunteer to be an election judge. It's critically important that we have enough judges to conduct our elections fairly and efficiently. So I'm grateful to all of you for participating in this panel and this discussion about the right to vote, and encourage you to focus on the November elections, which are critical for all of us.
Did you want me to jump in there?
Yeah, jump in for a.
Go in order? Hello?
You can go now.
Okay, all right, just making sure. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as President Preckwinkle said, vote, 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 vote. Right now, this is all about November and making sure that we exercise that amazing privilege and right that we have to vote. And I think that honestly, Americans are always going to have more work to do in our quest to form this more perfect union, right? I mean, that means we can never stop watching out for efforts to actively suppress citizens' rights to vote. We're seeing this every day right now. The United States has existed for 244 years. So you'd think that with age comes experience. But unfortunately, we have plenty of examples and evidence to show us that there's always going to be someone out there who's eager to take away someone else's right to vote. For 80 years, more than that, frankly, people in power tried to bar women from achieving the right to vote. And we know that in the 1950s and the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, activists in the South were beaten. They were bloodied when they attempted to ensure that African-American citizens could exercise their right to vote. These efforts to suppress the vote are still very much underway today. And let's be clear about who they're still targeting. It's Black and brown people, just like that, Black and brown people. No one's trying to suppress the vote in Wilmette, if you know what I mean. Now, every minority group in this country has a right to vote by law. If you're a U.S. citizen, you have a right to be registered to vote, and you have a right to vote. We know this. But now we have the person who holds the highest office in the world, the President of the United States, actively trying to suppress that right and limit people's access to the ballot box. The President of the United States. It's astounding. I mean, and it should be an affront to everyone who believes in the power and the beauty of a representative democracy. We saw textbook voter suppression just recently in Georgia in 2018 under former Secretary of State Brian Kemp, unfortunately now the governor, who narrowly won the race for governor that year. I would go so far to say that I think he stole that election because Kemp did everything that he could to keep people from voting. He purged voter rolls, held up voter registration applications, and closed voting sites. And African American voters, Black voters, bore the brunt of those efforts. It was disgusting to see, and we are now dealing with the consequences in Georgia with failed leadership, especially in the midst of a pandemic. So when you hear elections have consequences, there's a perfect example. Now, efforts to suppress the vote come in so many different forms: voter ID laws, restrictions on registering to vote, and also ensuring long lines at the voting booth, hoping that people just give up and go home. You know, arguments for each of these policies are frequently couched in claims of voter fraud, something that has absolutely been disproven time and time again. Now, these aren't foreign threats to our country. These threats are coming from the most powerful offices in the land, including, as I said, unfortunately right now, the President of the United States. Thankfully, here in Illinois, our state and local officials continue to take whatever steps necessary to make it easier to vote and expand access to the ballot box. And I'm super proud of these efforts. And I'd also like to say that, you know, thank goodness we have people like Stacey Abrams in this world, who is working around the clock to make sure that what happened in Georgia does not happen at the national level. So when we think about November, I don't know that we're concerned about losing Illinois, although we have to get out every single vote and not take anything for granted. But what happens at the national level is more important than ever. And so fighting these voter suppression efforts is critical today more than ever. We all have to take this super, super seriously. And we really have to understand what voter suppression looks like. And more importantly, we have to fight back to make sure that everyone has equal access to the ballot box. And while this is off topic, I am going to mention, please, if you haven't already, make sure that you are counted in the census, because we have two pockets of power here that have to be exercised. Number one is making sure that we get to the polls, whether it's physically or, as President Precwinkle mentioned, very importantly, through the mail. Ask for that ballot. The minute you get it, don't let it pile up in your mail pile. Please fill it out and send it back immediately. But also, for those people who cannot vote, and obviously for those who can, we want you to fill out your census. But there are many people who don't have the right to vote, whether they are undocumented or they're just legal residents waiting to become citizens. You have a powerful voice and you can exercise it through the census. And I really hope that if you haven't done it so far, please do so.
Thank you. I want to move on. It's just so terrific to hear from our two leaders here about the importance of voting. And of course, related to voting is the work that each of the organizations represented here does to further women's equality. We're not going to have nearly enough time to get into everything that all of them are doing. You know their names, you'll look at their websites. And so I'm going to now ask Audra, Cherita, Dorri, Felicia to give your little 60-minute or 60-second, I should say, elevator speech, so to speak. I know I'm being firm, but hey, age has some privileges. About what's important about the work you're doing in the context and your organization is doing in the context of what President Preckwinkle and Comptroller Mendoza have said. So Audra, I'll start with you.
So thanks so much. June 1st, I became the president and CEO of the Schreiber Center on Poverty Law, which is an Illinois-based, nationally focused organization that leads the fight for economic and racial justice. And we do so by litigating, shaping policy, training, and connecting people within the advocacy community. And as an organization, we've been looking at issues of systemic racism for quite some time. But prior to being at Schreiber, I was actually, as you mentioned, the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. And you've heard over and over, especially on this day of all days, that suppressing the right of women of color to vote, the suppression of women in the suffrage movement, and its legacy, that we're continuing to talk about that today. And the League has a very interesting history because its founder, though Carrie Chapman Catt had envisioned the state-by-state strategy to build momentum for women's suffrage, and founded the League of Women Voters at the Congress Hotel in Chicago on February 14th of 1920, had also made many controversial statements as it pertained to moving the 19th Amendment along, including ensuring white supremacy, strengthening white supremacy by women's suffrage, and also talking about uneducated immigrants and referring to Native Americans as savages. And it took another 45 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So that's the reason why we're still here today, 100 years later, having this conversation. And my organization is one that's leading the charge on combating systemic racism in an effort to achieve economic justice and racial justice. This is the reason why we are so involved in this process and trying to encourage everyone to vote, not only to exercise that hallowed right, but to understand what exactly is at stake.
Thank you, Audra. Women Employed, I'm Cherita Ellens with Women Employed, and Women Employed has been working on gender equity and pursuing gender equity and economic security for women since 1973. And we know in order to do that, we have to pass policy. And the only way that we can pass policy is the fact that we have this cornerstone of the right to vote and representation. We find ourselves like in this moment of time where our divisions are as visible as they were during periods of the antebellum and Reconstruction and civil rights. The rhetoric sounds the same. The hate looks, and at least it feels the same. Many of us come to work every day leading organizations with heavy hearts. Yet the expressions of hope and unity are also the same. At Women Employed, we believe that America's promise to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should be available to all its citizens, the same, without prejudice, without conditions, and that it's incumbent upon us and all of us that work on the side of justice and equity for all to keep up the good fight. We've been talking about voter suppression, and that it continues today, and we know the reason why Georgia happened is because the 2013 Supreme Court decision that struck down, a coverage formula that Congress has used to monitor the states with a history of discrimination, freeing them from having to clear their changes in voting procedures with the federal government. So we've seen that devastating. We've seen what that can do. Ajahn Poo stated at one point that the fact that we're the majority of everything, yet we're still treated as a special interest group, is one of the most absurd narratives in cultural Jedi mind tricks out there. And she couldn't have been more right. So I'm relieved that the complete story of the suffrage movement is finally being told, as I think it can be used as an inspiration for those today that feel disenfranchised and powerless in the struggle for change, and that they would use the stories of those shoulders that we stand on and the sacrifices that were made to whatever it takes to get out there and exercise their voice and to vote. Thank you, Cherita. Dorri.
Sure. So 60 seconds to talk about everything that the YWCA is doing is impossible. But what I'll say, we are the largest, most comprehensive women's services organizations, having started back in 1876. But what I'll say, I think you've heard such great examples from all the panelists so far, and really want to drill down on what President Preckwinkle and Susana has said, because I think it's so important. It often gets lost that this participation matters. Susana, you mentioned that the census is unrelated, but it's absolutely related, right? In terms of our ability to not only engage in the democratic process, but if census is for lots of reasons is more accessible than voting. So we need people to participate so they can get counted, and we absolutely need them to go vote. And the fact is that it matters with everything that we do at the YWCA. We're always, as my fellow panelists, are fighting for women's equality. But I think about, if we even talk about the pay gap and how that disenfranchisement of women having access to resources cumulatively impacts our ability to do exactly what President Preckwinkle says, contribute to those officials that we want to see get elected so that we can have more influence and power in people that understand our issues. I think about Lauren Underwood and our work that we're doing right now with childcare and that important issue that impacts a woman's ability to go to work, not to mention that child's ability to meet their academic achievements as we look at early learning, and how she could stand in Congress and represent that issue because women have supported her. So it's absolutely voting, it's absolutely influencing who our candidates are, and we have to participate in all of that. And with the work that we're doing at the YWCA, we are connecting all of those dots so that we don't get caught in the disparate issues and making people think, oh, it's just this or oh, it's just that. It's all of it, and we have to make sure that we're fighting the battle on many fronts so that at the end of the day, what people do, how people do vote and how people engage, in addition to what those people are representing as we vote, it all matters. And we can't afford to lose sight of that. I feel like in this crowd, I'm preaching to the choir for sure, but I do believe that everything that we do matters. And at the end of the day, that single act of voting can make a world of difference across all of those issues that we fight for every single day.
Thank you, Dorri. Felicia, yeah, I'm doing what the Comptroller is doing right here. Absolutely. Felicia.
Good morning. Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. There've already been some really great comments. Chicago Foundation for Women has been around for 35 years fighting for gender equity. We do this in some general ways, but also in some key focus areas. One of those areas is access to healthcare and healthcare information. It is clear that voting is important for women to have a say in what happens as it relates to the laws that are passed, and particularly the laws that are passed relating to their own bodies and the sense of agency in their own bodies. And so it's really important from that respect. When you look at, and I think Dorri touched on this, CFW works for economic security. Cherita Ellens and the team at Women Employed is often a partner in that work. But disenfranchisement for women, lower wages. It causes a decrease in your wages. So it's really important that women go out to vote. And right now, women are 51% of the population in the United States. And in the 2018 midterms, women were 55% of the voter turnout. So of registered voters, the women who turned out, registered voters, 55% of registered women voters turned out. So there's a lot of room for us to grow as it relates to that. And then the other thing is freedom from gender-based violence, which is extremely important. At the Democratic National Convention last week, there was a lot of talk about the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. It has gone over a year without action in reauthorizing that critical piece of legislation that provides safety for women in the place where you expect safety the most, and that's in your own home and in intimate partner relationships. And so those are just a few key reasons why this election is so extremely important for women, and how CFW is working every day to advance gender equity, including women's access to full political participation.
So speaking, I couldn't have had a better lead into the next question. Thank you for saying that, Felicia. Speaking of full political participation, as everyone who's listening knows, I'm certain, we need to push many more women into positions of leadership, the kind that President Preckwinkle and Comptroller Mendoza have in government. There was an amazing data point that was shared with me in preparation for this panel that Representative Jayapal, who's a Democrat from Washington, an amazing woman, noted in a speech she gave that only 79 of the 11,000 people who have served in American history in the U.S. Congress have been women of color. So we're, of course, concerned about women of every kind and sort and everywhere having the opportunity to engage in political office if they wish. And so this question here, beginning again with President Preckwinkle, relates to this idea about, if you were whispering in the ear of a girlfriend about what advice you would give her if she's interested in political office, what would you say to her about its importance?
Well, I think it's really important to elect women to office. Let me come back to Rebecca Si's Voter In. I encourage you to buy it and read it. If you have women in office, they're more likely to be inclusive and to have diverse staffs. I mean, there'll be more opportunities for women. There'll be more opportunities for people of color. My chief of staff is an African-American woman. I have 6 bureaus. 4 of them are headed by women, 2 women from the Latinx community and 2 African-American women. So, if you elect women, you will have a more inclusive and diverse leadership team and workforce in government. I mean, that's just what happens. And frankly, I wish that the corporate community had as much pressure on it to be diverse as government does. We have some real challenges in this country in terms of private sector opportunity for both women and people of color. But the first thing I'd say is, vote for women to run for office and leadership positions. So that's the first thing. And then, when you get into office as an elected official, you have an opportunity to mentor other young people. I always say you have an obligation to do two things, your job, whatever that is, but also to provide opportunities and mentorship and support for the next generation of public leaders. So one, elect women to office, and two, and that means women have got to run for office, so more women need to think about being candidates for office. And then when you get in that position, you need to do everything you can to support not just the women who are your contemporaries, but also the next generation of leaders.
Susanna, you are in that next generation after President Preckwinkle.
Yes, thank you very much, President Precwinkle. That was great. I mean, and look, if you'll excuse the sports analogy, I'd say that the key to a successful team is building a strong bench and then getting those players actually into the game, right? And what does that mean in politics? I'd say for starters, it means doing a better job of recruiting women for roles in elected office. And you still hear today that women often say that they have to be recruited. They've been asked by someone else to run because we are so self-conscious or for no good reason. A man only has to be told once and he's like, yeah, I'm running for president, right? A woman thinks of all the reasons why she's not qualified enough when in fact we're overqualified more often than not. And so look, when there's a vacant position, you have to be intentional about appointing a woman to the seat, and even more so a woman of color, because we are vastly underrepresented. Now, this helps them to get to know the people and the issues in their community. They deal with budgets and all kinds of other sorts of things. They get some name recognition, and it allows them, honestly, to solve problems and get some significant experience under their belt. So being intentional about these appointments is huge, because whether it's on the school board or the county board, but once a woman is actually in office, when another position higher up opens up, for example, let's say is a state senate seat, you'd have a bench at the county level to say, look, this person knows how to run budgets, this person knows how to legislate, and then you can bring them up the ranks and then once again fill an appointment with a woman, and hopefully a woman of color. So this is how you build the bench that leads to playing in the varsity league. And of course, we have to do better in supporting women of color through programs. There's training programs like I Will and Emily's List and others. And as President Preckwinkle said, once you're there, it's critical that we become a mentor to that next generation.
Right. Audra, your thoughts? I know prior to this position, you worked with a great Congresswoman, Robin Kelly, and probably have words of wisdom from her that you could share with us here, or from yourself.
Well, absolutely. I did work for 5.5 years as the Deputy Chief of Staff for United States Congresswoman Robin Kelly in the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois. Among the many appointments that she's had, including Chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust and member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, she's really been a rising star in the party. But interestingly, though, I've got a chance to meet Representative Jayapal and other dynamic women of color. And they are a smaller but mighty, mighty force in Congress. In a nutshell, if our government doesn't look like the people it's supposed to represent, that means that there are countless voices, perspectives, issues, challenges that certain communities are facing that do not have a voice. And that is the reason why it is so important that more women are running, and particularly women of color. But people have to understand that it requires a lot of support. There are so many amazing and dynamic and talented women out there, but they need financial support. They need exposure to networks. As Comptroller Mendoza just mentioned, it's so important creating that pipeline to groom women and encouraging them to enter politics at all different levels. Because quite frankly, whether you're serving in your local municipality or you're aiming for Congress, every position is important. There is a pipeline that we need to create so that women can move up as they see fit. Or quite frankly, there are some folks who stay at the local level who have been just dynamos and powerhouses. And that can sometimes work with our schedules because we are mothers, we have other responsibilities, and that sometimes keeps women from wanting to run. But they need to understand they need to be engaged at every single level of government. Not everyone has to run for president, although we're happy they are. But we need women engaged at all stages.
Cherita, I know that you've probably seen some of this fabulous work by local women at Women Employed. What's your thought about this?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. We know that political empowerment and representation is one of the 4 measures used to rank gender equity by the World Economic Forum. We also know that the United States remains at the bottom half of that throughout the world. So 3 to 4 generations later, since the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 2016, women outnumbered men at the ballot box by 10 million. And in this upcoming election, a stat just came out that both parties have broken records, and there are a number of 287 women who have secured their primaries for the House. So think about what we could do if we won all of those seats. The House would be more than half women. So what else do we need to do? As Audra said, they need support and support in financial backing, but also support in knowing that once they get into office, that we will have their back, that they're not going to be AOC on the steps of Capitol Hill being accosted by their coworker. They're not going to have to answer for their previous romantic relationships in parallel to their career track like Senator Harris has had to do. So those are things that we have to do. We have to support organizations right now like Higher Heights, She the People, Women Lead. They are all working right now to make sure that they can train and prepare and marshal the needed resources, particularly for women of color to want to run and win office across the country.
I'm getting chills, I have to say. I think it's time to rest on our laurels and retire, Toni, but not really, right? Dorri, you and I have had many conversations about this, and I wanted to hear from you, of course, on your thoughts on what you've seen at the Y. You're all over Cook County and an international organization besides.
No, I just think that, as I listen to all these fabulous women, I'm not sure that this isn't by design. If you lower our confidence at a very early age, then we won't get to positions of power, right? So I'm not convinced that this is not by design as I sit here and listen, because we all know for everything you all said that representation matters, but it really is about power, because power allows us to really institute the policies, the practices, the environments that we could all thrive in. And so by having folks that are not like us in position of power, then we don't get to have those opportunities to thrive. And you see it's so systematic though, right? How it's occurred, right? We take our young girls, we tell them that they're not good enough, they're not pretty enough, they lose all confidence, and then we all of a sudden get surprised that they don't run 20 years later for any elected office, right? We have to stop the marginalization of women and encourage them to participate. You were talking about soccer earlier, Comptroller Mendoza. Participate in sports, get involved, get engaged, start these practices of engagement early so that we can have folks that by the time that they get to the ages that they can run, that they want to engage in different ways. It's just so frustrating to me as I think about how our experiences are just not represented at all. The fact that we're just talking about the Crown Act, right? You needed Black women to come and say you should not discriminate against our hair. The fact that even the notion of that was unimaginable because people didn't realize that it was happening because they were not representing people that it was happening to. And so I just think until we really just continue to recognize that it is by design, that we just have to continue to dismantle it. We have to continue to lean into it. We have to continue to encourage those who do have even an inkling, call that little girl bossy and push her forward, right? So that we have the hopes that one day she will be in a leadership role representing our issues that are getting missed because folks just aren't representing us, period.
Speaking of representation, of course, we're now going to hear from Felicia, and that's what CFW is all about, and about promoting women leaders. And so, Felicia, your thoughts on how do we move more women into these positions of public leadership?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said, and I'm going to reiterate what Dorri just said, because my 22-year-old son, sent me that quote 2 days ago. I want every girl who's told she's bossy, as if that's a negative thing, to be told that she has leadership skills. And I think it starts from an early age. It also really is important when women are running. And so as President Preckwinkle and Comptroller Mendoza says, so let's assume women are running. When they are running, ask them substantive questions and not questions that you would ask, I don't know. You don't ask the men the questions that the women are asked. Stop making comments about their hair and their makeup, and start really focusing on the policy. And when they're in office, and I think Cherita touched on this, and Audra, we have to call out misogyny every time that we see it and be very clear about it, because it's already, to get through the gauntlet to break through and run. I mean, those statistics are startling. Out of the 11,000 members of the House, I think you said there were 79 in our history who have been women of color. And let's own the intersectionality of that, right? Let's own the fact that the experience in running for office for a white woman is a different experience for a Black woman or a woman of color. And let's be honest about what that means. In the structure of the history of racism in our country, in order for us to say we're equal and getting to equal, today's Women's Equality Day, and we are working still to get there, then we have to be honest about the experience of women when they run. I mean, the old adage, if you're not at the table, if you are not at decision-making tables, then you are on the menu. You are financially vulnerable. Your healthcare access may be limited. For a lot of those reasons, women have to be and should be at every place where decisions are being made. And that means every level of government included.
Right. And I would say, just as we think about this some more, and I think that Comptroller Mendoza alluded to this, it's running for office, it's elected office, but it's also appointed office, right? There are boards and commissions and library systems, school systems, all of the above. And I know Felicia alluded to this too. So for those of you listening out here who think, well, maybe running for office isn't for me, but serving the public is for me, do think about this. Do go on your local government's website, see what those positions are, choose to participate, contact your local women's organization and ask them to host a seminar about how to run and how to write the letter and all of that. There's really nothing more important, as we look ahead. And speaking of that, we are living in this historic moment. Another time when I had shivers running down my back and started to cry, which was last week watching Senator Kamala Harris deliver her acceptance speech at the DNC. And of course, watching her for many years as a student of women in politics, and I guess as a teacher of women in politics too. And the thing about it that strikes me for today that I'd like for you all to comment on is, she is there in a unique way, right? She's the third woman to be a VP nominee, but the first woman of color. And as such, and as our panelists have pointed out, she has an amazing opportunity, along with running for office, to build an intersectional community of women, of feminists, a movement that will go on far beyond January or November. Because, of course, as we know, even if she and Vice President Biden are elected, our work stands. We have to continue it. It's not going to stop. So I'd like for each of you, beginning again with President Precwinkle, if you could comment on this notion of building an intersectional women's movement and what it will take in your view.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate Senator Harris and commend Vice President Biden for having chosen her. She's an extremely intelligent and talented woman. This is a milestone, but we have a long way to go. And to come back to Felicia Davis's point, we have to look at the way in which she'll be treated by the media and on the campaign trail. And she's going to have to endure a lot of sexism and abuse, frankly, that men are never subjected to. So just a quick story. When I ran for County Board President, there were a lot of comments about the fact that I wore flat shoes and not heels. And so we put out a little bumper sticker that said sensible shoes, sensible government, sensible politics. But whoever talks about the shoes men wear or the clothes they wear or how they wear their hair. Another one of my favorite discouraging reminders is that, Michelle Obama, First Lady of the United States, was a Harvard Law School graduate. But there was a lot of discussion about the fact that she wore sleeveless dresses. I mean, this is a big deal, right? Whether the First Lady of the United States, a Harvard Law School graduate, wears sleeves. This is not about, her competence, her intelligence, the ways in which she was supportive of and involved in the administration and public issues that she cared about. No, it was about the dresses that she wore. I mean, we're in a place where women have more responsibility, and there are more women in elective office than ever before, but we're still in a place where women are not treated the same on the campaign trail, and where we have to have both hides of alligators and good humor as we participate in the political process. So I know that Senator Harris is an immensely talented person. As I said, this is a milestone. We still have a long way to go, and we undoubtedly see that she will have an interesting time of it on the campaign trail.
Susanna, your comments about how she can lead us in this intersectional community of women?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I want to say that I think Michelle Obama has awesome style, and the guys are just jealous. Toni, that's what was going on there. But all kidding aside, I am super excited about the possibilities for Kamala Harris. I mean, her nomination for vice president is breaking so many glass ceilings. Now, she has to win, right? The presidency, besides vice presidency, I think the presidency is frankly very well within her reach. We're right there, but we have to win. I mean, so many of us were shattered. Our own internal glass ceiling was shattered when we thought Hillary was going to break that last glass ceiling, and it didn't happen. So, this is why we have to vote. November, vote, 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 vote. We can take nothing for granted. But, should Kamala Harris become vice president, never again would there have to be a little young Black or Indian girl who thinks that the highest office in the land isn't available to her. I think that is so profound. I also think it's super exciting that children, especially young children, young adults, will be able to look at Kamala and be reassured that the doors to the White House are open to them. When I was a little girl, I was a Mexican-American girl growing up in Illinois in the 70s and 80s, and there wasn't anybody who looked like me serving the highest levels of government. I mean, I feel like it's really important. And because there wasn't anyone, why would I think that that was even possible? But now there are, more people. I will say there's not enough, but there's certainly more people who look like me in those roles, and I'm one of them. And that makes me really happy to think that some little Mexican girl growing up in Illinois, that doesn't even cross her mind because I'm there. So that means she can be there someday. And I'm really thrilled that every day, we're able to support other women who are seeking to serve their communities and our country. And that's really important that we continue to do that. So I personally feel like Kamala is going to win. And should that happen, it's really going to change the dynamic for future generations to come in such a positive and healthy way. And I can't wait to see the day when I can say, of course, we have a Black woman or a Latina woman or an Indian woman in the White House in the most important seat behind that resolute desk. This is our country, but it really shouldn't be as monolithic as it has been when it comes with the presidency has looked like for all of our lifetimes. And this is the beginning of changing it. So I'm super excited.
Audra, speaking as the Comptroller was about vote her in, your thoughts about building this sort of intersectional feminist community focused on political advancement?
So obviously I'm biased to Kamala because my family is Jamaican, so I had to give a little shout out to her. I'm excited. I think it's so wonderful in what she represents. The fact of the matter is American women as a whole are extraordinarily powerful voting bloc. And in moments like this, it's wonderful to celebrate Kamala's nomination, and it brings us together. But I just wanted to make something very clear. I think sometimes what happens, and this is a point that Felicia made about owning our intersectionality, there's too often that women talk about coalescing without acknowledging structural racism and deeply rooted prejudice. I mean, that's the essence of what we do at our organization, Schreiber. That's to combat this entrenched racism and combat these attitudes. We have to understand that our white women peers have been beneficiaries of the structural racism. So it's not enough to just celebrate. It's not enough to spout platitudes, but we have to really think about how we meaningfully include and receive the participation of women of color. So that means everyone, including our white female peers, have to be not only willing to call out sexism, but they must also call out racism.
Right.
And
Right.
so that is something that I would just say that as we're excited and celebrating Kamala, it is imperative that not only are we talking about, it doesn't matter what shoes that she wears, but we have to call out our peers when there are comments that are made about her ethnicity or anything related to anything but her just being a dynamic candidate.
Yes, and we're just getting into the heart of this. I wish we could keep going all afternoon, although I'm sure Toni will tell us to stop, being the teacher she is. So Cherita, Dorri, Felicia, quickly, and then we'll just have some closing words. I know we haven't done justice to the topic, but hopefully we'll be able to gather again. Cherita.
Thank you. One, I share everyone else's sentiment in the special feeling that I had seeing her accept her nomination, seeing someone that looked like me. I also want people to understand that that doesn't come with a magic wand to just do away with the systemic racism and sexism and misogyny that we are faced with in this country. Putting her as vice president doesn't just automatically put the women's movement into this role of intersectionality and accepting of women of color leaders. All of us on this panel understand that. All of us on this panel are living that. All of us on this panel have been put in positions with the expectation that now that you're there as a Black woman, now all of a sudden all of the racial inequities disappear within the women's movement and within our organizations. And that is just not true. We have to do the work. That is a first step. The second step is the work.
And Dorri, speaking of the work.
Well, I'll just quickly add that I'm happy because of all her different dimensions that make her bring these intersectional pieces together, because we know that we're in an environment right now that it's going to bring all the hate to the forefront. And so so to me, all the intersectionality becomes a platform for all the folks that didn't see it before. We thought we saw sexism with other women that have run before. We saw the racism with other people of color that have run before. Now we have a woman that has all these dimensions to her, and now we're going to see it all. And the question is, once we see it, what are we going to do about it? And so I think that this gives us a great opportunity that now it's going to be out there because they're going to come for her. And we need to be, as many of the panelists have said, we need to be there to start pointing it out and say, okay, now you see it, what are you going to do about it? Because it's not just our responsibility, because I've been saying this for 140 years. If women could get rid of sexism, we would have done it by now. So now we need all of y'all to recognize that it's there and engage with it and help us actually do something about it. So it's out there. It's going to be out there now. So we now have to. And
Felicia, quickly, and then I want to turn back to President Precwinkle for some final words.
Absolutely. I also think that this moment, if in Chicago, as an example, there's a generation of girls who are growing up who have a Black woman as their county board president, a Black woman as their mayor, a Black woman as their treasurer, a Latina as their clerk, and in the state of Illinois, a Black woman as our lieutenant governor. So there's a generation of girls here who see that leadership and who see themselves reflected in that leadership. I hope that the achievement of intersectional women of color in the vice president's office will also open the doors in the corporate offices. And I just read a Fortune magazine article recently where in September there would be 38 women in the Fortune 500 rank. So that's 38 out of 500. In Chicago, in a lot of ways, we go against the trend. We also have here, even in philanthropy. So in Chicago, there are 20 women of color at least who are leading some of the largest philanthropic organizations in our city, but that's not the reality everywhere. So in Chicago, we are really a forward-thinking city in a lot of respects and pushing the envelope there, but I'd like to see the translation of that in the corporate sector as well, and that hopefully that if we get an intersectional woman of color in the vice presidency, then corporations will also give women more opportunities in the CEO roles in their organizations.
I want to thank you all. I'm so grateful for the opportunity for us to have this conversation. I hope it continues, and I want to turn to President Preckwinkle, who convened us for final words here.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of our panel participants for their willingness to share their their insights and thoughts today. I'm really grateful. I want to thank Rebecca, of course, for being willing to moderate this panel. You know, I feel about women the same way I feel about Black folks. We've made a lot of progress in this country. We have a heck of a lot to do, a long way to go. And the challenge for us as women of color, as women, is that we can't do this by ourselves. We have a lot of work that we have to do, but we can't do it by ourselves. We need the support of the broader community, and that means men, that means white folks of both genders. And that's a real challenge, especially as we look forward to November, when we have a president of the United States who's pretty explicit about his racial appeals to white folks in this country. That's been kind of the foundation of his campaign. If you look at the way in which he's demonized the protesters, if you look at the way he's demonized immigrants, if you look at the way he's demonized folks who have been looting, I mean, his whole approach is to appeal to the most racist and white supremacist, acknowledged or not, segments of our nation. And that's profoundly troubling as a campaign strategy. It's profoundly troubling to our democracy, I would argue. So we have a lot of work to do, and we need to engage partners across the board to try to do that work. I want to thank everybody today for taking time to talk about these important issues.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.